Okay, good morning all. Can someone just quickly give me an indication that you can hear me?
Yes, sir, we can hear you. Morning.
Yes, we can hear you. Morning, sir.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. There's still people joining, so we'll quickly give them a few minutes just to join, and then we will start. Okay, so make sure you have your notes out. We're going to start with Gaseous Exchange today. And I'm basically just going to give you an overview. But yeah, I'll discuss that now when everyone is in. Okay, so it seems there's no one else who's trying to join. So I'm going to start. Before I officially start, I'll just quickly check back in. So let me just quickly move over here. Okay, so you should be seeing my PowerPoint now. Okay, so what I'm going to do in this lesson, so I don't know, okay, let me start off. I don't know if you've seen that, but you guys will be coming back next week, Monday. So obviously that means the stuff that we had planned for next week on Google Classroom, that will not take place since we will be back in person teaching. So since that means we are only going to get halfway through Gaseous Exchange, I thought I'll do it anyway, and I'll try and make this a good overview lesson so that when you come back into class, you have some sort of idea about what Gaseous Exchange is, why it is important, and kind of how it works. But I'm not going to try and rush through the whole lesson. I'm going to try and make this a good overview lesson, but we'll see if that is effective. Okay, so make sure you have your notes out in front of you. And I am going to go through the stuff early on quite quickly. So anything that you do miss, you can obviously catch on Google Classroom. The slides are posted there. So yeah, make sure that you make use of that as well. Okay, so Gaseous Exchange is basically, as this picture indicates, the system that involves the lungs. So we did do this in grade 9. So if you remember from grade 9, then okay, you might have some idea of the things that we are going to be discussing. So this involves, your lungs involves breathing in air which is rich in oxygen, which is then needed by the cells in your body for respiration. So you can see that all four of these last topics that we did, photosynthesis, respiration, nutrition, and gaseous exchange, are very closely linked. Okay, nutrition had to do with, or let's start with photosynthesis. Photosynthesis had to do with plants having to make food by the use of the sun, energy from the sun. And then that food is eaten by animals, and us as omnivores then eat plants and animals, and we break down that food again into the nutrients, and then those nutrients can then be used, or specifically glucose can then be used for respiration inside of the body or inside of our cells. But in order for respiration, we need oxygen. So that is where the gaseous exchange system comes in, where we then breathe in oxygen. The oxygen then travels via the blood to the cells. Same with the nutrients, also travels via the blood to the cells. And then inside of the cell, respiration can take place. So you can see how all four of these systems are interlinked. So we won't try and trick you too much with having to combine knowledge from the various sections, but it is important that you understand that the four systems are interlinked. Okay, so let's jump into gaseous exchange. Okay, so first of all, just to clear up some terminology, because this is one of the major mistakes that, or misconceptions that learners have at the start of the section. Okay, so we've already done cellular respiration. So whenever we refer to respiration, that's what we refer to. We refer to cellular respiration. Okay, I know it is confusing because we refer to the lungs as the respiratory system. And in years past or in primary school, you might have referred to breathing as respiration, or yeah, there's good reason why it's confusing. but just know that whenever we refer to respiration, we refer to the process that happens inside of the cells. Okay, so that is where your body uses the glucose and then breaks it down and then releases the energy. Okay, so that's the process that we did last week. Okay, so don't get confused between respiration and gaseous exchange. Okay, but before we get to gaseous exchange, breathing is the physical act of taking air into your lungs. Okay, also sometimes called ventilation. Okay, so that is breathing, breathing in and out. Okay, quite simple. And then gaseous exchange is the process that happens at the surface of the lungs. Okay, so once the air is inside of the lungs, gaseous exchange is what's going to happen at the surface of the lungs where the gases are going to exchange. Okay, so oxygen goes into the lungs and into the blood, and carbon dioxide goes, into the area of the lungs and is then exhaled again. Okay, so gaseous exchange is the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide across a gaseous exchange surface by diffusion. Okay, but don't worry, if any of this seems confusing at this point, we'll explain the process by which this happens in depth a bit later on. Okay, but for now, just know or just make sure that you understand the difference between these three processes. Okay, why is gaseous exchange necessary? Well, basically for, as we discussed, for respiration. Okay, so we need oxygen for respiration. So we somehow need to get oxygen from the atmosphere into our cells. Okay, so gaseous exchange is important because it absorbs oxygen from the atmosphere and it makes that oxygen available to all of your cells for respiration. And then once respiration takes place, it produces carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide is a waste product that is toxic to the body. So now your body needs to get rid of that. And that is also the gaseous exchange process. Okay, so carbon dioxide is released during respiration and must be removed from the body. Too much carbon dioxide will cause the pH levels in the body fluids to drop. Okay, so you cannot sustain high levels of carbon dioxide, so you need to get rid of it. Okay, so gaseous exchange is necessary to exchange those two gases. Okay, then, requirements for effective gaseous exchange. So I'm very quickly going to go over this because we do discuss this again later. So what is needed to make gaseous exchange efficient? So if you look at any organism and you analyze any part of that organism, then you can usually spot how, why things are the way that they are to make it good at that specific thing. Okay, so simple example, like animals that hunt to kill their, to get their food, is specialized for that function. Okay, they might be able to move very slowly or very softly. They might be able to camouflage or whatever the case may be. They are specialized for that function. So everything you can analyze inside of biology, well, almost everything you can analyze inside of biology will have some of these specialized traits that make it specialized for that function. So what makes the lungs so good at gaseous exchange? So firstly, it is quite thin. So the layer where gaseous exchange takes place, that squamous epithelial layer inside of the alveolus, which we'll discuss later, is a very thin layer. Okay, so that makes it possible for the substances to quickly diffuse in and out. Okay, so there isn't a thick layer that it has to make its way through. Okay, it can easily, quickly diffuse in and out. Then moisture is also very important because things absorb a lot easier if it is dissolved in some sort of liquid. Okay, so that's the same reason why you need mucus and moisture inside of your digestive system, because the absorption is a lot better if the nutrients is dissolved in a liquid. So similarly, if the gases is dissolved in a liquid, it can diffuse a lot quicker into the lungs. And obviously, that is beneficial. Okay, so if there isn't a mucus layer in your lungs, okay, then it makes it more difficult for the body to absorb the oxygen. So then you will feel short of breath, okay, because you're breathing in enough air, but your lungs doesn't have enough time to absorb all of that air. Okay, so for that reason, we have the inside layer of the alveolus is coated with a mucus layer. But again, we'll get to that later. Then a large surface area, again, as we've mentioned now a number of times, okay, the larger the surface area, the easier it is to absorb things. So that is why we have routers. That is why the small intestine is folded, okay, to increase the surface area for maximum absorption. In this case, okay, increase the surface area for maximum gaseous exchange. Then the whole system for gaseous exchange is well protected. Okay, so again, we'll discuss this later, but it needs to be well protected because of these thin membranes, okay, which are quite fragile and can easily get ruptured or damaged if you're exposed to some sort of blunt force trauma or some sort of pathogen that you inhale. Okay, so it is fairly well protected. There's a few protective mechanisms, not only the ribs on the outside that protect it physically, but also some protective measures that prevents things from getting into the lungs if it's not supposed to. Okay, so there's a few protective measures to make sure the membranes don't get damaged. Then it's close to the transport system. So again, when we look at the alveolus and how it absorbs oxygen and gives off carbon dioxide later, then we draw literally the blood vessel right next to the alveolus, because that's basically what it is. The blood vessels wrap around all of the alveoli to make the transition from the lung to the alveolus to the blood as quick and seamless as possible. Okay, so we have blood vessels. So by transport system, we mean blood vessels. The blood vessels are close to the lungs to make the absorption and the gas exchange a lot more efficient. And then lastly, all organisms will have some sort of ventilation system. And this is because you need to bring air in and out of the lungs. Okay, and we call that ventilation. Okay, so as simple as that. Okay, that was a lot longer than I anticipated, so let's go on. Okay, then the next part you don't need to know, so I think it is crossed out in your notes. If it is not, then you're welcome to cross it out. Okay, so this was removed from this year's curriculum, and this is basically where we just discuss how a bunch of different organisms do gaseous exchange differently and how they are adapted for their specific needs. So we look at the leaf, which we looked at in grade 10 as well. We also look at the earthworm, insects in general, fish, and then mammals. Okay, but like I said, you can cross this out. You don't need to know it for this year. You're welcome, obviously, to read through it, but we're obviously not going to spend time on it now. Okay, then just the diagram of the lungs, and then also the diagram of the infundibulum. I'll get to that now. So I'll quickly run through this, but again, this is something that I don't want to spend too much time on. So we start off with the trachea. Okay, the trachea is the hard part of your throat. So if you feel your throat, okay, that bony part that feels like kind of like there's lines on it, that is the trachea. Okay, so the trachea is connected to the air passages, so basically the tubes going from the nose and the mouth, and it brings air into the lungs. It's situated before or in front of the esophagus, and in the pharynx, so right above the trachea, is the area called the pharynx. And the pharynx has a system whereby it can deter, or it sends food down the esophagus and air down the trachea. Okay, so we looked at that. I think, do we look at it here as well? No, we looked at that when we did nutrition, where we looked at how the epiglottis or the glottis opens and closes to let air down the trachea and food down the esophagus. Okay, but don't worry too much about that. If you need to recap it, then you can go look at your notes about nutrition. But then air enters the trachea, so this is where we start now. Then from the trachea, it splits into two branches, okay, called bronchi or singular bronchus. Okay, so it splits off in those two branches, and then it further subdivides into many more smaller branches, called bronchioli. Okay, so think of this basically as an upside down tree. So you have the tree trunk, which is the trachea, and then that splits into two branches called the bronchi, or singular bronchus, and then that's further subdivides into many more smaller branches called bronchioli. And then at the ends of the bronchioli, you will find the alveoli, okay? Or in the case of the tree, you will find the leaves. Okay, so in this case here at the end, you find the alveoli, and the alveoli is clumped together, almost like a bunch of grapes. It's often described as, okay, looking like a bunch of grapes. So these alveoli are round structures, but they are clumped together. And when they are clumped together, then they look like this. Let me just quickly see. Yeah. Okay, then they look like this. And this is called the infundibulum. Okay, so make sure that you know these labels as well. So this is just a zoomed in version of one of these structures over here. Okay, and then each infundibulum has a number of, okay, these round structures, okay, called the alveoli. Okay, the alveoli is the kind of most important part, because that's where the gaseous exchange is going to happen. But we'll look at that later on when we look at the process a bit more in depth. Okay, so for now, just make sure that you get the idea of the overview of the lungs. So here's another or few other labels. You have the ribs, which help with the breathing process and also protection. The lung itself, which is just all of the structures. And then the diaphragm, which is a muscle, which is the main muscle involved in the breathing process. And we'll look at that at the end of this lesson. Okay, also here you have the pleura, which are membranes which prevent friction. Okay, but you'll see that in the notes. And the intercostal muscles, which are the muscles between the ribs, which allow the ribs to expand to increase the area in the lungs to breathe in. Okay, but again, we'll look at that later on. Okay. Then I don't know how to get out of here now. Okay, sorry, let me just quickly go back in. Okay. Okay, then next we have the table with all of the different parts. I'm not going to go over this. You can read through it. It's basically what I just discussed a bit more in depth. So make sure that you know the table and use the parts that are highlighted to kind of see what's the most important parts in each or most important information about each part. But yeah, I'm not going to go through every single part now. Okay, then what we actually want to get to today is the, no, come on. Okay, is adaptations for efficient breathing in mammals. Okay, so we look at mammals as a bit more broadly, but basically we're looking at the human gaseous exchange system. Okay, but humans are a kind of mammal, and all mammals have a similar system. So we look at all of mammals, but the one that we focus on obviously is the human system. Okay, so you'll see that a lot of these parts we've already discussed, but now we're just talking about how specifically it works in mammals. So for instance, one of the things needed for efficient gas exchange is a large surface area. So the way that mammals achieve this is by having many of these alveoli. So you just looked at the diagram of the gas exchange system, and you saw all of those literally millions of alveoli in the lungs. And by having so many alveoli, you increase the surface area for gas exchange. Okay, then the gas exchange surface is thin. It only has one layer of squamous epithelium. So it only has to go through one layer, so it can quickly go from the lungs into the blood. Okay, then also, as mentioned, the inside of the alveoli is moist, and this helps with or dissolving the gases, so it gets absorbed more easily or diffuses more easily. The transport system around the alveoli is very efficient, so there's a lot of blood capillaries, and this moves the gases away from the lungs so that more gases can come in very quickly. But again, we'll discuss that a bit more depth later. Then protection. So protection is provided by the ribs and the sternum. So those are the bony structures around the lungs that prevent you from easily puncturing your lungs or damaging your lungs through some kind of trauma. And then also the pleural membrane. Okay, so as I quickly alluded to earlier, the pleura are two membranes with fluid in between, which prevents friction. Okay, so the fluid in between makes it so that the two membranes don't have to rub against each other, because that friction will cause damage to the lungs. Okay, so the pleural membranes, they prevent friction between the lungs and the chest cavity, basically. Okay, and then the ventilation system is achieved through the ribs and the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles. But again, we look at this in a second. Okay, so I'll discuss that then. Okay, so basically what we need to know from here is this exact slide. Okay, so this is a typical question. Mention 4 adaptations of mammals for efficient breathing. Okay, then you have to mention large surface area and then why that's important or how that is achieved. Okay, so that would be 2 marks for each thing that you mentioned. Okay, so that's why I split it into 2 parts. The first part explaining what is the adaptation and how that is achieved, why mammals have a large surface area. Okay, so there isn't much more to explain here. I'll maybe recap it in class, but I'm not going to spend too much time on it now. And then I'm stuck again. Why? Okay, there we go. Sorry. Okay, adaptations of red blood cells for its function. So again, this is recap from grade 10. So if you remember, someone has a question, I hear in the background, or just mute your mics, please. So from grade 10, you would remember that the red blood cells are biconcave, meaning they basically, if you take a rubber ball or a tennis ball and you squeeze it from both sides and it makes these dimples on both sides, that's basically the shape of the red blood cells. And this makes it so that you have the same amount of surface area, but it takes up less space. Okay, it appears in stacks to take up less space, and it contains hemoglobin, which transports oxygen and carbon dioxide. Okay, I'm not going to spend time on this. This is very minor information. Okay, then what I actually wanted to get to for today, the kind of overview that I wanted to have for today's lesson. Okay, the mechanism of breathing. Okay, so there's two main parts of gaseous exchange. We discuss how breathing works, how you get air into the lungs, and then we discuss the gaseous exchange of how these gases then make its way into the body. Okay, so for today's lesson, I want to give you an overview of breathing. Okay, so breathing is divided into 2 parts, inhalation and exhalation. Okay, fairly simple. Inhalation, air moves from the atmosphere into the lungs. Exhalation, air moves from the lungs back into the atmosphere. Okay, hopefully no one is tripped up by that. Okay, then a bit more in depth. How does inhalation work? So this is a process that you have to know. Okay, you have to be able to explain inhalation. You have to be able to mention every part and what it does. Okay, so firstly, inhalation is an active process, meaning it requires you to actively breathe in. Okay, whereas if you exhale, you just relax and let the air flow out. Okay, so inhalation is an active process. It requires energy for that reason. Okay, so the first thing that happens is the diaphragm contracts, which flattens it. So the diaphragm is dome-shaped. Okay, let me get my marker out again. Okay, so the diaphragm is dome-shaped, okay, when it is relaxed. Okay, so it's shaped like a semicircle. Then when it tightens, when the diaphragm contracts, then the diaphragm moves down and it flattens out. Okay, and what this does is it increases the volume inside of the lungs. I'll show you this now with a model that I have here, but just understand for now that the diaphragm, when it contracts, it flattens. So it goes from this dome shape to this flat shape. Okay, then that causes the thoracic cavity to enlarge from the top to the bottom. Then the second thing that happens is the external intercostal muscles contract. The internal intercostal muscles relax, but the main important part is knowing that the external intercostal muscles contract. And these are the muscles that sit kind of on the outside of the ribs, and when they contract, they're going to pull the ribs up. Okay, so this causes the ribs to move forwards and upwards. So if you take a deep breath in right now, then you put your hand on your chest, then you would feel that your ribs move slightly forward and upwards. And this, again, increases the thoracic cavity, okay, enlarges the thoracic cavity. So two things happen to enlarge the thoracic cavity. The diaphragm contracts and moves down, and the external intercostal muscles contract to move the ribs forwards and upwards. Okay, but again, we'll recap this so you'll get used to this terminology and all of this information. And then when the thoracic cavity enlarges, the volume increases. Okay, so that makes sense. There's more space, so more volume. But what happens when the volume increases, the pressure decreases. So these two things, volume and pressure, is opposites of each other. So when volume increases, pressure decreases. Okay, and if you think about this a bit more, okay, then it does make sense. So if you take your water bottle and you decrease the volume, so you squeeze the water, the bottle, then the pressure inside increases and the cap might fly off. Okay, so the opposite thing happens when the volume increases. Okay, but if you don't quite understand that, then all you need to remember is that these two are opposites. When the one increases, the other one will decrease. Okay, so volume increases and pressure decreases. Okay, and this then causes air to flow into the lungs. Okay, so I'll recap this, but let's quickly look at exhalation then as the opposite of this. And again, I'm stuck. Okay, let's do this again. Okay. Okay, so then exhalation is the opposite of inhalation, obviously. Okay, so inhalation, air goes into the lungs. Exhalation, air goes out of the lungs. So exhalation is a passive process. So again, you can try this at home. You breathe in, that requires you to do something. Okay, however, when you breathe out, you just relax and the lungs go back to normal and it pushes the air out. Okay, so that's why it's a passive process. Okay, so in this case, the diaphragm relaxes, okay, which causes the diaphragm to move back into the dome shape that it had at the start. Okay, so it relaxes and it goes back to its normal position, which is the dome shape. Okay, then the external intercostal muscles relax, causing the ribs to move back downwards and inwards. Okay, so basically it just means the ribs collapses back to where it was initially. Okay, so it moves downwards and inwards. Okay, so into your body. And this causes the thoracic cavity to become smaller, okay, or the thoracic cavity to decrease in size, from side to side and from back to front. The fact that the thoracic cavity decreases in size or becomes smaller decreases the volume. Okay, so the volume decreases, and again, volume and pressure is opposites of each other. So when the volume decreases, the pressure increases. And when the pressure increases, the air is going to flow out of the lung. Okay, so again, if I'm going to quickly see something. Okay, so I'm going to switch over to my camera. Okay, so if I were to take this water bottle and I squeeze it, okay, and I increase the pressure, then the air inside or the water inside wants to come out. Okay, now I'm not going to make a mess all over my desk here. Okay, but if I were to, then me increasing the pressure, oh, that happened anyway. Okay, causes the air to want to escape. Okay, because the pressure outside is less than the pressure inside. And when that happens, okay, the air is going to want to move out. So the same thing happens when you're breathing. Okay, when the pressure inside of the lungs decreases, okay, then the pressure outside is more than the pressure inside of your lungs. So it's the air is going to want to come into the lungs. Okay, so that is inhalation. Then when you relax again and the pressure inside of your lungs increases again, the air inside is going to be pushed out of the lungs. Okay, so hopefully you understand that process. Okay, so let me quickly do this with the bell jar experiment. So this is also in your notes. I'll get to that now. So this is basically a simulation of your lungs. So here, the blue swimming cap is your diaphragm. So you can see that it starts in this dome shape. Well, hopefully you can see. Okay, so it starts in this slightly dome-shaped position. Okay, so it is slightly indented, basically. Okay, and the lungs, so hopefully you can see the lungs, is deflated at the moment. So if I were to pull down on the diaphragm, okay, then the diaphragm, okay, let me do this more accurate, physiologically accurate. Okay, so it starts as a dome shape and then it moves to this flattened position. Okay, and that causes the lungs to inflate. Okay, and you can actually hear it here. Okay, so the diaphragm moving down, okay, causes the lungs to inflate. And the reason why this happens is because when we are in this position, okay, the air around here, okay, is equal to the air pressure on the outside. Okay, so no air is moving in and out. Okay, but as soon as I pull this down, then the volume inside increases and the pressure inside decreases. And this causes air to want to rush in by the mouth, okay, or just the hole in this model. Okay, and then exhalation is the opposite. So now we go from this position and we go back to our normal position. Okay, so the diaphragm moves back into its dome shape. Okay, and you see what happens to the lungs. Okay, it deflates again. So by me pushing on this back into its normal position, the volume inside decreases, the pressure increases, and this forces air out of the mouth, okay, or out of the lungs. Okay, so I hope this makes sense. Okay, if not, go through it a few times, think through it a bit, take a water bottle, play with the water bottle, okay, spurt water everywhere, and then hopefully that helps you to, okay, visualize and understand the concept of volume and pressure a bit better. Okay, so I'm going to move over back to my screen, and we'll just quickly look at the experiment, and then that's where we will end today. So forced exhalation, I skipped. It's basically just exhalation with a bit of oomph. Okay, so, but you can read through it. It's basically just when you forcefully exhale, when you want to shout, or when you are breathing very heavily and you force air out. Okay, so it's similar to exhalation, just it's not passive anymore, it's active. Okay, but for now, we want to look here at the model of breathing. Okay, so this is the bell jar setup that I just showed you. So you have the glass tube. In my case, it's not glass, but you have the tube, which represents the trachea. And the trachea then splits into the bronchi. Okay, so the branches coming off the trachea. Okay, so that is the glass tube. Then you have the bell jar itself, which represents the chest cavity. You have the balloons, which represents the lungs. And you have the rubber sheet, which represents the diaphragm. Okay, so I think one of your activities that you have to do is with regards to this setup over here. Okay, so you have to explain what's happening over here. Okay, yeah. So the method that I just went through is you pull down on the rubber sheet to and observe what happens, release the rubber sheet and observe what happens. Okay, so hopefully you just observed what happened when I pulled it down and released it back. Okay, then what you would have seen is when the handle is pulled down, the rubber sheet moves down and air is sucked in by the Y tube and fills the balloon. Okay, so when the diaphragm pulls down, air rushes in and fills the balloon. When the handle is released again, the sheet moves up, the balloon deflates, and air is forced out of the Y tube. Okay, so again, I hope that my demonstration showed that to you. Okay, so what conclusion can we draw from this? Well, when the rubber sheet moved down, the volume increased in the bell jar and the pressure decreased. Okay, so again, please make sure that you understand this concept and the relationship between volume and pressure. Okay, so the volume increased, okay, because the size of it, the size inside increases. Okay, so that means the volume increases. And when that happens, the pressure decreases and air flows in. When the rubber sheet moves down, the volume in the bell jar decreased and the pressure increased, which caused air to flow out. Okay, so the best way to probably see if you know all of this is to complete this table. Okay, so this table is in your notes, and okay, it's everything that we just discussed. You just complete it. If you're unsure, then you can do it in pencil. And if you can complete this table without referring back to your notes, then you should be fine. Okay, so you have to say what happens to each part or every item over here when during inhalation, and what happens with every item during exhalation. So, for example, inhalation, what happens to the diaphragm? Does it move up or does it move down? Okay, but don't just say up or down. Okay, you must also say, does it contract and move down, or does it relax and move up? Okay, so you have to be a bit more specific. So that's why I say it's probably best to use your pencil in this case. But try and answer this, and yeah, if you can, then you aim for okay. So what happens to the diaphragm? What happens to the external intercostal muscles, the internal intercostal muscles? And then what happens to the volume? What happens to the pressure? Okay, what happens to the pressure on the outside? The atmospheric pressure is the pressure outside of the jaw or outside of your lungs. Okay, what happens to that pressure? Okay, so that one is going to make you think a bit. And then lastly, how does the air move in and out of the jaw or in and out of the lungs? Okay, so I think your first homework with regards to this section is to complete this table. Okay, so it's probably going to be easiest if you try and complete it now. Okay, and that's where we're going to end today's lesson. So I don't know how long that was. Oh, 40 minutes. Okay, so for once I didn't talk way too much. Okay, so quickly, if there's any questions, then ask now. Otherwise, good luck and see you guys next week.
Bye, sir.
Bye.
Hi, sir. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you guys for joining and good luck. Enjoy the rest of the week.
See you, sir.
Bye. Okay, I'm going to hang up now since it doesn't seem like there's any questions. Enjoy your week. See you next week.